Okay. Professor Conrad, how in your career did you start working with global history, and what defines it in your conception?
Thank you. That's already two questions. So I'll start with the first one. Thanks for having me, first of all. And yes, my own path into global history is clearly shaped by the way I was taught in Germany, in German universities. When you study history, at least when I did, this was German history, almost exclusively German history. As it was very similar in other countries. If you studied history in Italy, it was Italian history. If you studied history in France, it was always nationally compartmentalized history. In my own case, I had a double major. I also studied Japanese history, Japanese language, and so forth. And then throughout my time as a student, I found it difficult to actually bring these two together in any meaningful way. Japanese history clearly was not part of the history department. And so for a long time, I looked for ways and frameworks that actually helped me to think about these different places together. In my own case, for quite some time, post-colonial studies in the 90s and the 1990s in particular was a very powerful, I thought, framework that helped me to think about the relations between different parts of the world, and also helped me to think about the German and the Japanese experience in the 20th century together. But then, as we moved into the 21st century, the challenges and also limits maybe of post-colonial studies gradually became more salient, and global history emerged as a new field that I found extremely helpful and productive and liberating even. And since then, for me, it has been the most efficient, most also productive way to think about relations, connections, and different places. So this is my own, if you will, trajectory into this field. If you will, you could say, for me personally, global history came along at exactly the right moment. It helped me to, frame my thinking in a way that otherwise would have been very difficult. Now, you also ask what global history is for me. Now, in the broadest possible terms, it is, of course, to move away from one country history, from the history of, as it's typically taught in schools, but also in universities, the history of your own country. So that already, that would be sort of the broadest possible approximation. Obviously, if we discuss this in a more specific and disciplinary sense, then I would say it is the study of history that foregrounds connections, but also is interested in the way in which the world gradually becomes integrated, such that whatever happens in one place can also be partly explained by processes that are much larger, broader, are transnational, and sometimes even global.
Renato?
Okay. Professor, sorry my weak English. I don't speak. I'm still learning this. And the second question. Amanda, quando ele responde, não é melhor a gente deixar a tela só com ele?
Não, acho que não.
Não? Tá. Okay. What are the possibilities for dialogue between the local and global, the micro and the macro?
Yeah, thank you. That's it's a very good question. Not least because probably for most, if you ask people on the street what global history is, they may not know it at all. But if they have some idea, then they would probably think that global history is the history of the planet. It's the history. It's a history that's macro history, really. Huge processes, different continents, different civilizations. This is what most people typically associate with global history. And also because some of the most influential books in our field, most influential studies, have been of this kind. They have been total histories, for example, of the 19th century, or of all of history, right? So probably, I mean, so let's, let's take Chris Bailey's book on the global history of the 19th century, or Jürgen Osterhammel's book, again, of the 19th century. You could also think even of a more, popular book like Yuval Harari's book, Sapiens, which is on all of history. These are all macro histories, and therefore global history has this macro history image. But if we look at what most global historians do, then this is really not what most of them are actually after. Most of them have very concrete research projects that focus on a particular event, a particular place, a particular society, and try to see it through a global history lens, try to understand it in a global history framework. And this can also be microhistory. In fact, some of the most interesting work in recent years has been exactly happening at this intersection between micro and global. There's a very interesting special issue of the journal Past and Present that came out just a few months ago, dedicated to this relationship between micro and macro. And I mean, also personally, I find productive to think about particular individuals, particular small topics or small locations, and to place them in a global context. I recently wrote an article that focuses on two architects who lived around 1900, one in Tokyo, Japan, the other in Calcutta in Bengal. They never met, but their trajectories are sufficiently similar or related through broad processes, very broad global processes. So to look at these two people and their own, the two biographies, and then to think about, their agendas in a global context, that I found particularly challenging on the one hand, but also productive on the other. So I would say there's no principled contradiction between micro and macro.
Okay. And how to work with the multiple temporalities of global history? Is there a short-term global history?
Yeah, that's interesting that you asked the question this way, because in one way, one could even say that much of global history is precisely about the short term. Now, what I mean here is this. So traditionally, historians have looked at sort of long-term, change over time. So I don't know, the gradual emergence of a sense of Vietnamese nationhood, the gradual emergence of the bourgeoisie in Buenos Aires. These are the typical questions. While global historians, instead of looking at the longue durée within one country, typically focus on a global moment where it's more about the synchronous impact of different factors, right? So instead of looking at the last 200 years, they look at this one moment and see how different events influence what we study. So in other words, the traditional question would be, what has been the long-term build-up to the French Revolution? While the global history question would be, if we think about the 2011 Arab Spring, how have events in Tunisia influenced events in Egypt or in Bahrain, right? So in that respect, methodologically speaking, there is a short-term dimension to global history, I think. But at the same time, of course, it would be short-sighted if global historians only looked at the sort of the synchronous present. And one way to think about this that I find useful is this term layers of time that has been introduced by Reinhard Koselleck, the German historian. He calls it Zeitschichten, layers of time, which essentially means that there are, like in, for example, Fernand Braudel's work on the Mediterranean, there are different processes that have well, different temporalities, let's call them. And it is only by looking at these different temporalities at the same time that we can actually understand, in their confluence, in the way in which they work together, we can understand an event. So that, I think, is true for national histories, and it is true for global history as well.
Okay.
Next question is, does the type of object, research object, have the potential to become a global history?
All right, yeah, that's again a good question. Also a question that many of my students ask me when they think about their MA thesis, for example. So the way I think about global history is to look at it primarily as an approach, right, as a perspective. In other words, it's not that we can look at the world and say, these are global history problems, this is a topic that's not global. But instead, we can look at any topic as a global historian. Like, we could similarly say we can look at any problem from a gender history perspective. Is, the history of the post office a gender history topic? Depends on what you want to do. But if you have a gender history lens, then obviously, how post offices work, how people, who is recruited, how the relationship at the workplace actually works, can be a gender history project. And likewise, the same, I'd say, is true for global history as well. In other words, it is a particular lens that we use to see what we study in a particular light. It helps us to ask specific questions and will maybe marginalize other questions at the same time. So in principle, I would say there's no topic where we could not at least ask to what extent a global approach is helpful. But that said, it is of course true that some topics lend themselves to a global history approach much more than others. And if you look at what many global historians are doing, it's quite obvious that many of them, they're fascinated by people who move, right? So they will typically study travelers, they will study migrants, they will study refugees. Global historians like sailors, people on ships who move from one place to the other. So there's definitely a tendency to emphasize mobility, and it's much easier to come up with a global history question when people are moving. So one of the challenges in this article that I just mentioned in just a few minutes ago, that I wrote on two architects, was that one of them, he traveled the world. He took 3 years to travel from Japan via China, India, all the way to Europe, the America, US, and then back. The other one never moved much. So a methodological challenge was for me to understand that also the person who did not move was still shaped, by some of these large processes. Imperialism, for example, the arrival of capitalism and new forms of plantation labor and so forth. So even when not moving, you can still experience and be subjected to global forces, obviously, right? So it's important, I think, for global historians not to only focus on the mobile part of the population, not least because that was usually just a tiny elite or those who were compelled to move. But in any event, it was usually a small part of the population for most of history. So therefore, to only focus on people who are moving would be a distortion of sorts. So therefore, I think it's crucially important that we also look at the way in which, for example, peasants are not really the favorite object of the global historian. They're pretty much stuck where they are, sometimes tied to the soil. They're not allowed to leave. But they experience global changes of the labor market, of trade relationships and so forth, sometimes to an even greater extent. So therefore, so that's, I think, an important point to make. but I want to come back to my point of departure. So global history is a perspective which will yield more results for some topics and questions than for others. In other words, if I have a topic and I start researching it, I would like to think about it in a global perspective, but sometimes it's also obvious that other questions and other perspectives are just more relevant. So if I study, for example, marriage patterns in, I don't know where, in, let's say, Paris in the 1860s, yeah, I can probably force it into a global framework, but most of my answers will lie closer to home, and a standard social history approach would be probably just more efficient. So the quick answer to your question, Renato, would be, in theory, yes, any topic, but in practice, sometimes it's not going to be very useful to go global.
Okay, and lastly, in your opinion, what are the main risks and the main challenges in global history?
You already want to spoil the fun, and now you're asking about the problems. Right, yeah, but it's important. I think you're right. It's important to, even, if we embark on a global history journey, it's important to think about and reflect on the limits and also the pitfalls, the problems, the challenges that you mentioned. But let me preface this by saying, we know that there are always, any approach will have limits. Any approach will bring to light new realities, new questions, but at the same time will also shut out others. In the case of global history, what I think is particular, we can talk about all kinds of issues here, but I want to highlight three of them specifically here. The first one is something that we just mentioned a minute ago. The overemphasis on mobility, I think, is a real problem in global history. We see many works that celebrate also the individual traveler, as if crossing borders in itself, is already something to celebrate. Crossing borders obviously can be a good thing. It can also cause all kinds of conflicts. It can result in violence. It can be part of a larger pattern, but it can also be just one person moving without any real effect. So the overemphasis on mobility, and this is something that I think global history owes to the sort of this early moment of globalization and the overall celebration of transculturalism, of interconnectedness and so forth. That is something that is still with this approach to some extent, and I think we need to find ways to overcome it. The second point I would like to highlight is there's a certain tendency, and this goes back to a question that Renato asked earlier about the micro and the macro. There's a certain tendency to in global history to privilege macro processes as the major causal factor. So, for example, we can, if we look at two individuals, we can analyze what they do, but then we zoom out and then we come to huge processes like industrialization, nation building, a world economic crisis. And the more we do this, the more we open up the space of what we actually look at, the more anonymous these processes become, and the more difficult it is then to actually talk about individual agency, individual interests, even individual responsibility, right? So while it's clear that when you talk to your roommate or your friend next door, who's at fault, who forgot to, I don't know, buy milk last night, then it's very clear then, your neighbor is at fault. But as soon as we move to these broader processes, as soon as we, then not talk about a particular person and what she did, but about how industrialization began to change urban society in a port city, as soon as we move to these processes, and even if we go global, but more sort of broader, if we go global, if we talk about the effects of the world economic slump in the 1920s, as soon as we move to that level, then individual responsibility almost completely disappears. So we need to find the right mix, I think, between an awareness of these broad structures, but clearly we don't want a history where individual agency disappears, or where, to put this a little polemically, a form of history without people. Now, yeah, so that's one. And the third one that I would mention here, if you want to, we can add more problems, but I don't want to scare listeners who are still interested in this project. So the third problem that I see on the long run is that the term global itself will lose some of its explanatory power. At the moment, I still find it quite helpful to move us away from strictly nationalist histories, right? Move us away from histories that are focusing on one country, one society only. And therefore reference to broader processes. And it's helpful to just simply call them global to make sure, we're all in the same conversation. But I can easily see already today, but even more so a few years down the road, that to talk about all kinds of different connections as global is also not going to be very helpful. I mean, we will ultimately need much more specific descriptions of what we talk about. So, when you think about your last holiday and you call it global, if you think about, I don't know, let's say, it's obvious, it's easy to say the world financial crisis in 2008 was a global phenomenon. But then people also talk about the tourism as a global phenomenon. They talk about the British Empire as a global force. If we go back in history, probably also the Mongol Empire was a global force. But the logic of all these connections is so different that if we use the term global for all of them, we're ultimately not saying very much. So what we will need is a vocabulary that still captures trans-border exchange, still captures broad processes, but doesn't use the same term for every single one of them. So that's what I foresee. We'll be much more specific in the way in which we describe phenomena. And already now, sometimes the reference to global is a way to avoid speaking about what really matters in this specific case, right? It's almost a strategy of evasion, of avoiding to tackle more specifically what is a causal factor. That said, so this I think is a third sort of methodological limit and problem. At the same time, for the time being, we always have to think about two aspects of this problem at the same time. So on the one hand, we need a more refined, a more sophisticated conceptual apparatus or analytical framework to think about the past. But also, what we also need to do is we need to think about the way in which our universities, our history departments are organized. We need to think about the way in which history is taught in the school system. And for that purpose, which is much more an institutional purpose, or almost you could call it a political purpose. For this purpose, it just doesn't help if we if we differentiate and say, this is a trans-border process, this is a European-wide process, this is an imperial process. We just need one term to really change the structures of education. And therefore, I think for that purpose, this broad umbrella term global history is still very powerful and effective, and therefore I wouldn't want to let it go prematurely.
Okay. Oh, thank you so much for participating.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for asking very good questions, challenging ones, and I do hope that next time around I'll actually be in Florianopolis to discuss these issues together with you and your colleagues as well.
Oh, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. let's hope the world changes again soon.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.